says if we are going to transform America into tomorrow's dominant force, that's their phrase, then it's going to be a long process unless there is a catastrophic and catalyzing event, dash like Pearl Harbor.
So, what happened? Well, September 11th happened, obviously, and George W. Bush had to rethink. But for many of those around Bush, there was no rethink. There didn't have to be. Long before September 11th, a small, influential group of neoconservatives here in Washington had wanted to see the United States transformed into a sort of benevolent ruler, unchallenged, astride the world. And long before George W. Bush was elected, they sat down and they wrote down a manifesto.
The document was effectively a charter of the Project for a New American Century, a neoconservative think tank in Washington.
The founding members included Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz of the Defense Department, Richard Pearl, head of the Defense Advisory Board, Louis Libby, Cheney's chief of staff, John Bolton, Undersecretary of State for Arms Control, like Cohen, who's on the Defense Policy Board.
Much of what these men wanted is coming true. They urged that the U.S. abandon the anti-ballistic missile treaty. It has. They wanted establishment of more permanent U.S. military bases abroad. That is happening in the Philippines and in Georgia and will likely happen in Iraq. They urged regime change as a goal of foreign wars, not just in Iraq. They wanted the U.S. as a global constabulary, their word, unburdened by the UN or world opinion, preventing any challenge to U.S. dominance. But, they wrote, a year before September 11th, such aspirations are unlikely to be realized without a catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor.
It was spring of the year 2000. The last U.S. presidential campaign was in full swing, and Texas Governor George W. Bush had wrapped up the Republican nomination.
We get to send a signal that we're sick and tired of Clinton Gore in Washington, D.C.
He needed a running mate. The Bush family asked an old friend, his father's defense secretary, Halliburton CEO Dick Cheney, to lead the search for the best man. It didn't take long for Cheney to find him.
I'm proud to announce that Dick Cheney, a man of great integrity, sound judgment, and experience, is my choice to be the next Vice President of the United States.
Mr. Cheney, how do you feel about being picked, sir? Pretty good.
Dick Cheney's relationship with George W. Bush has been characterized in many ways as the president's mentor, his minder, as the man who's really in charge.
Not me.
What Cheney and those close to him also brought to the White House was an absolute belief that the 21st century would belong to America and that it would start with the overthrow of Saddam Hussein.
Saddam is ousted. You get rid of the top leadership, you get a moderate Ba'athist regime, and a democracy flows out of like water out of a fountain. And not only will democracy flow in Iraq, it'll flow into Syria. Syria will see the light. The Iranians will still see the light.
Seymour Hersh is one of America's foremost investigative journalists. He says even before 9/11, Dick Cheney was insistent the U.S. must invade Iraq and begin changing the world.
Just go in, it's going to roll over. They believe this. They believe this. Utopian, idealist, crazy.
Dick Cheney's moment arrived with those jetliners on September 11th. his plan was now on the fast track. After September 11th, as after the invasion of Kuwait a decade earlier, it was Dick Cheney's job to sell a war against Iraq.
We all have to recognize as a nation that 9/11 changed a great deal in our lives.
We know that Saddam Hussein had the intent to arm his regime with weapons of mass destruction.
We do know with absolute certainty that he is using his procurement system to acquire the equipment he needs in order to enrich uranium to build a nuclear weapon.
According to Seymour Hersh, selling that nuclear threat was crucial for Cheney to convince Americans to support the war.
With that case, they could not only win the public, but they could win the Senate, the Democrats in the Senate. You have to understand, without that case, I don't think they could have gotten the authority.
The problem was that though the Central Intelligence Agency had been tasked to find evidence of Saddam's WMDs, especially nuclear weapons, that's not what the best information showed. Dick Cheney visited CIA headquarters. Not once, the record shows, but 8 separate times. He's said to have wanted to see more forward-leaning intelligence on Iraq.
Analysts get the drift. They get the drift. They write reports critical, they go nowhere. They write a report that supports the White House. All of a sudden, they're giving briefings at the White House. Come on. Everybody gets the drift.
About the same time, the Pentagon established a secretive group to work closely with the Vice President on intelligence matters. It was known as the OSP, the Office of Special Plans.
Their starting point was not, let's try to figure out what was going on, but let's see what kind of information we can come up with to justify the policy line that we wish to pursue.
Greg Thielman was an intelligence specialist with the State Department who watched the emergence of the OSP. It soon became clear to him what its mission was and who was behind it.
Cheney was the driving force behind an orchestrated presentation to the American public of a different version of reality than at least the reality that we saw.
In the intelligence business, that's called cherry picking, selecting individual morsels of information that support a certain view. And stovepiping, sending them without analysis right to the White House to be inserted into the president's script.
Facing clear evidence of peril, we cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun.
When I heard those speeches and read the transcripts, I recognized many of the anecdotes, many of the examples from things we were being given.
Former Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Karen Kwiatkowski was at the Pentagon, working closely with the OSP staff.
Having seen the intelligence, I knew that this was a manipulation of information. It was cherry-picked information, out-of-context information, in many cases information presented as confirmed when in fact it had not been ever confirmed by the intelligence community.
For instance, Kwiatkowski says the OSP touted an attempt by Saddam to purchase uranium for a nuclear weapon, without explaining it occurred almost 15 years earlier when Iraq was a U.S. ally.
It bothered me a great deal because I saw it to be manipulation. I saw it to be conscious manipulation, not an oversight, but consciously done. It's how it appeared to me.
Hey, how are you? Nice to see you. How you doing?
Another example, a primary source named Ahmed Shalabi, then perhaps the best-known Iraqi expatriate. His organization was paid more than $300,000 a month to provide intelligence to the Office of Special Plans.
Well, come on, you pay somebody $345,000 a month, you're going to get your money's worth, right? He wants to keep the checks coming. He's going to keep telling you things.
How are you, sir? Fine. Pleasure to meet you. Thank you. How are you?
Chalabi, a convicted bank swindler who hadn't lived in Iraq since he was 13, hoped to become the new Iraqi president when Saddam was ousted. His OSP reports were routinely optimistic, predicting American troops would be greeted as liberators.
This is what allowed Iraqi National Congress, Chalabi, reports that have proven to be either completely fabricated or completely wrong, to get to the President of the United States without the proper kind of labels.
We asked ex-CIA Director James Woolsey if intelligence gathering could also be improperly influenced by Dick Cheney's unprecedented 8 visits to CIA headquarters.
Would you accept it as possible that the reaction to that kind of relationship with the Vice President would be what
some call stovepiping or cherry picking, where you look for the kind of intelligence you believe they want and give it to them?
I suppose it's a possible reaction of someone, but if people reacted that way as intelligence officers, they ought to be removed and replaced by people with backbone.
You don't believe that kind of thing happened in this case with Iraq?
I wasn't present in any of the conversations, but whether the vice president said something with a frown on his face or a smile on his face, it doesn't matter. It's the DCI, the CI director's job to encourage his people to call it straight, and it's their job to call it straight.
But former Pentagon staffer Karen Kwiatkowski says that's not what she saw happening.
If you disagree with Dick Cheney, the highly predictable result is you will no longer be working for Dick Cheney.
Indeed, as 2002 became 2003, and the drums of war grew louder, the intelligence quoted by U.S. officials was unanimous. Saddam Hussein was unquestionably a nuclear threat.
Within a 2-week or 3-week period, every senior official began to talk about mushroom clouds. How many believed it? I think most of them did.
When we return, truth and consequences at the White House.
It is essentially the betrayal of our country. It is a treasonous act.
Some hard-nosed people took over the direction of American policy, and they never bothered to inform the rest of us. I went through the Pentagon 10 days after 9/11. I couldn't stay away from Mother Army. I went back there to see Don Rumsfeld. I'd worked for him as a White House fellow in the 1970s. All this is in the book. And I said, am I doing okay on CNN? He said, yeah, fine. He said, I'm thinking about it. He says, I read your book, and he said, this is a book that talks about the Kosovo campaign. And he said, I just want to tell you, he said, nobody's going to tell us where or when we can bomb. Nobody. He said, I'm thinking of calling this a floating coalition. What do you think about that? I said, well, sir, thanks for reading my book. And, he said, thanks, that's all the time I've got. Really. And I went downstairs. I was leaving the Pentagon, and an officer from the Joint Staff called me into his office and said, I want you to know, he said, sir, we're going to attack Iraq. And I said, why? He said, we don't know. He said, I said, well, did they tie Saddam to 9/11? He said, no. And then I came back to the Pentagon about 6 weeks later. I saw the same officer. I said, why haven't we attacked Iraq? We still going to attack Iraq? He said, oh, sir. He says, it's worse than that. He said, he pulled up a piece of paper off his desk. He said, I just got this memo from the Secretary of Defense's office. It says we're going to attack and destroy the governments in 7 countries in 5 years. We're going to start with Iraq, and then we're going to move to Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. I said, 7 countries in 5 years. I said, is that a classified memo? He said, yes, sir. I said, well, don't show it to me. He was about to show it to me. He said, because I want to talk about it. The purpose of the military is to start wars and change governments. It's not to sort of deter conflict. This country was taken over by a group of people with a policy coup. Wolfowitz and Cheney and Rumsfeld, and you could name a half dozen other collaborators from the Project for a New American Century. They wanted us to destabilize the Middle East, turn it upside down, make it under our control.
A year ago, Paul O'Neill was fired from his job as George Bush's Treasury Secretary for disagreeing too many times with the president's policy on tax cuts. Tonight, O'Neill, who is known for speaking his mind, talks for the first time about his 2 years inside the Bush administration. His story is the centerpiece of a new book being published this week about the way the Bush White House is run. Entitled The Price of Loyalty, the book, by a former Wall Street Journal reporter, draws on interviews with high-level officials who gave the author their personal accounts of meetings with the president, their notes and documents. But the main source of the book was Paul O'Neill. Paul O'Neill says he's going public because he thinks the Bush administration has been too secretive about how decisions have been made.
Contrary to how we practice politics today in this country, there is some market for the truth.
You interviewed how many other people?
Oh, hundreds of people.
Hundreds?
Hundreds of people.
How many other cabinet members?
Several. Let's just say several.
But O'Neill is the only one who spoke on the record. Didn't someone in this administration, high up, call him on the phone and warn him not to do this book?
Yes, yes.
And who was it?
Don Rumsfeld.
And what happened at President Bush's very first National Security Council meeting is one of O'Neill's most startling revelations.
From the very beginning, there was a conviction that Saddam Hussein was a bad person and that he needed to go.
He says that going after Saddam Hussein was topic A 10 days after the inauguration, 8 months before September 11th.
From the very first instance, it was about Iraq. It was about what we can do to change this regime.
Now, everybody else thought that grew out of 9/11.
No.
But this book says it was day one of this administration.
Day one, these things were laid and sealed.
As Treasury Secretary, O'Neill was a permanent member of the National Security Council. He says in the book he was surprised at the meeting that questions such as why Saddam and why now were never asked. It's all about finding a way to do it. That was the tone of it. The president saying, go find me a way to do this.
For me, the notion of preemption, that the U.S. has the unilateral right to do whatever we decide to do, is a really huge leap.
And that came up at this first meeting.
It did.
O'Neill told us the discussion of Iraq continued at the next National Security Council meeting 2 days later. He got briefing materials under this cover sheet.
There are memos. One of them, marked secret, says, plan for post-Saddam Iraq.
Nation building.
Absolutely.
So they discussed an occupation of Iraq.
In January and February of 2001.
Based on his interviews with O'Neill and several other officials at the meetings, Susskind writes that the planning envisioned peacekeeping troops, war crimes tribunals, and even divvying up Iraq's oil wealth. Susskind obtained this Pentagon document, dated March 5, 2001, entitled Foreign Suitors for Iraqi Oil Field Contracts. It includes a map of potential areas for exploration.
It talks about contractors around the world from, 30, 40 countries, and which ones have what intentions or
on oil
in Iraq.
During the campaign, candidate Bush had criticized the Clinton-Gore administration for being too interventionist.
If we don't stop extending our troops all around the world in nation-building missions, then we're going to have a serious problem coming down the road, and I'm going to prevent that.
The president had just run a campaign about being humble and not engaging in nation building.
The thing that's most surprising, I think, is how emphatically, from the very first, this administration had said X during the campaign, but from the first day was often doing Y, not just saying Y, but actively moving toward the opposite of what they had said during the election.
So they have a really delicate balance to walk between keeping us relatively fearful, but not so fearful that we stop what we're doing and really examine how it is that they've been waging.
There are a lot of people who lie and get away with it.
and that we will in fact find weapons or evidence of weapons programs that are conclusive.
I don't think we'll discover anything myself. It appears that there were not weapons of mass destruction there.
You said you knew where they were.
I did not.
We know where they are. They're in the area around Tikrit and Baghdad and east, west, south, and north.
Well, first of all, I haven't lied. There are a lot of people who lie and get away with it.
Talking about lies and your allegation that there was bulletproof evidence of ties between Al-Qaeda and Iraq. Was that a lie?
Intelligence gathered by this and other governments leaves no doubt that the Iraqi regime continues to possess and conceal some of the most lethal weapons ever devised.
Our people are going to find out the truth, and the truth will say that this intelligence is good intelligence, no doubt in my mind.
I don't know anybody that I can think of who has contended that the Iraqis had nuclear weapons. And we believe he has, in fact, reconstituted nuclear weapons.
Saddam Hussein is determined to get his hands on a nuclear bomb.
We cannot wait for the final proof. He's got him. He's got him. The smoking gun. He's got him. That could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Colin Powell didn't lie.
My colleagues, every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources. These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence.
He has not developed any significant capability with respect to weapons of mass destruction. He is unable to project conventional power against his neighbors.
Our people are going to find out the truth.
I have not suggested there's a connection between Iraq and the 9/11.
You have said in the past that it was, quote, pretty well confirmed.
No, I never said that.
Okay. I
never
think
said
that is...
That's absolutely not. What I said was, it's been pretty well confirmed that he did go to Prague and he did meet with a senior official of the Iraqi intelligence service.
Saddam Hussein aids and protects terrorists, including members of Al-Qaeda. Secretly and without fingerprints, he could provide one of his hidden weapons to terrorists or help them develop their own. What did Iraq have to do with what?
The attack on the World Trade Center.
Nothing.
He said there were three main reasons for going to war in Iraq. Weapons of mass destruction.
Saddam Hussein has gone to elaborate lengths, spent enormous sums, taken great risks to build and keep weapons of mass destruction.
The claim that Iraq was sponsoring terrorists who would have attacked us on 9/11.
Before September the 11th, many in the world believed that Saddam Hussein could be contained.
And that Iraq had purchased nuclear materials from Niger.
The regime is seeking a nuclear bomb.
All three of those turned out to be false.
First, just if I might correct a misperception, I don't think we ever said, at least I know I didn't say, that there was a direct connection between September the 11th and Saddam Hussein.
Who does the president think he's effing kidding?
Of course, it was information that was mistaken.
There are a lot of people who lie and get away with it.
Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere. Nope, no weapons over there. Maybe under here.
When you have a precedent set like that, and you have somebody, George Tenet, acknowledging in his book that he knew that the administration was deceiving the American people into a situation that is murdering young men and women from this country and others, that George Tenet and Dick Cheney and Condoleezza Rice and George Bush et al. should be in fucking jail.